And now it's time to talk about. So, today we have been talking about how we develop a sense of who we are. But what has a stronger influence? Have you ever wondered why you are who you are? For example, why is one person hot-headed when the other person he just goes with the flow? Why is one adventurous and willing to go skydiving, for example, when the other prefers being safe in a comfortable environment, just reading a good book? What dictates your personality? The majority of our human characteristics are due to our genetic makeup. Environmental factors do not play as large a role as many people may think. Nevertheless, while genetics are important, this does not mean that the environmental factors cannot have an influence on one's variation. This Are You a Natural study describes how personality is formed, and personality is the subject we are currently discussing in class. This research gives our audience insight on how much genetics and environmental factors influence one's personality and IQ. Prior to this study, psychology was dominated by behaviorism, the idea that all human behavior is controlled by environmental factors. However, researchers Thomas Buchard and David Lycan were not satisfied with this theory. They wanted to come up with a scientific method to separate genetic influences, nature, from environmental forces, nurture, on people's behavior and personality. They recognized that the only way to test for genetic effects is to study people who have same genetics, namely identical twins. If twins are separated at birth and raised in significantly different environments, the researchers could assume that behavioral and personality characteristics that these twins have in common as adults must be genetic. Therefore, they could weigh the effects of nature versus nurture on one's behavior and personality. If environment is responsible for individual differences, are identical twins who grew up in the same environment significantly more similar to each other than identical twins who were raised in separate environments?
Okay, so for the methods of the study, the participants in the study included monozygotic twins who were raised together. The study did not specify how many pairs of such twins participated or where they were from. Additionally, the study recruited 56 pairs of monozygotic twins who were separated early in life, raised apart for most of their lives, and reunited as adults. These twins came from the United States and 7 other countries. We assume they were adults, although the study never specified. For equipment and materials, 4 personality trait scales, 3 aptitude and occupational interest inventories, and 2 intelligence tests were used. Checklists of household belongings and a family environment scale that measured how the participants felt about the parenting they received from their adopted parents were used. They were also administered a life history interview and a psychiatric interview and a sexual history interview. So for the procedure, the study has a quasi-experimental research design. The researchers set out to find monozygotic twins that were separated at an early age and remained apart until they were reunited as adults. They recruited the participants through word of mouth as the news of the study was spread around. The participants individually completed approximately 50 hours worth of various tests, which were stated above, to determine as many human dimensions about each participant as they could. They yielded a large database of information and interpreted their results. So the data that recorded was personality, interest, and intelligence data. They also gathered information about each participant's environments. Finally, they collected data regarding participants' life histories and sexual histories. Because this research was not an experiment, it did not have dependent variables. Rather, the study was simply measured and recorded the participants' results and did not use controls or variables. So to go over the research question again, if environment is responsible for individual differences, are identical twins who grew up in the same environment significantly more similar to each other than identical twins who were raised in separate environments? Okay, so this is how they measured the psychological constructs. To measure intelligence, the researchers used intelligence tests such as the Welsh's Adult Intelligence Scale with 10 to 15 subtests and the Raven Intelligence Test aimed at measuring one's cognitive problem-solving skills. The completion of these tests resulted in IQ scores, which is what psychologists use to measure intelligence. As for personality, the multidimensional personality questionnaire and the California Personality Inventory were used. Both of these tests are comprehensive questionnaires with hundreds of questions designed to uncover personality traits, which are broken down into categories. These categories are what the researchers measured and are the hypothetical constructs. Furthermore, psychological interests were determined through the Strong Campbell Interest Inventory and the Minnesota Occupational Interest Scale. These tests are designed to reveal interest which may lead to future educational or work pathways as well as social attitudes. Finally, the participants were measured and compared.
So, as for the results, psychology in the Western culture has been dominated by, for over 50 years by environmental thinking or behaviorism. They expected the nurture side to be the biggest influence on personality and IQ. Here's the table they came up with in their study. As you can see, the characteristics that they studied are on the side. So these were done with questionnaires or surveys and intelligence tests. And then this first column, the RMZA, those are the twins that were reared apart, and these are the twins that were reared together. So these numbers are correlation data, and so the closer they all are to 1, the number 1.0, then the likelihood that those twins are completely alike in those categories. And so they did it for both the reared apart and the twins reared together, and then they compared those two, and they found that a lot of them were either almost to 1 or over 1, and so that meant that the twins that reared apart and the reared together were very similar. Where am I at? So, in the question of did these results match their predictions? No, the results did not match their predictions. This study was conducted at a time when psychology in Western culture was dominated by behaviorism, as I said. They believed that people's experiences molded their personalities, not their genes. The researchers discovered that the human characteristics are a combination of genetic and environmental influences. Specifically, IQ is attributed to 70% genetics and 30% remains subject to increases or decreases due to the environment. So, interpreting these results. The results show that the monozygotic twins who were raised in separate environments grew into adults who were extraordinarily similar in basic psychology and personality. This tells us that there appears to be little effect of the environment on identical twins. Additionally, the twins that were raised in the same setting also were found to be very similar and more influenced by their genetic makeup than their environments.
The researchers mentioned how family environments, for example, exert less influence over who the kids grew up to be than do genes they inherit from their birth. This study is important because it shows that while one's environment can have a level of influence on personality, it is one's nature or genetic makeup that it has the most influence. However, this does not mean that the environment is irrelevant because, after all, the monozygotic twins who were raised apart were not exactly the same, a result that must be taken seriously as well. Critics argue that Picard and Lycan's study were insufficient and failed to consider some strong environmental influences on the twins that other cases discussed. These specific influences were not mentioned. Some also criticize against aspect of twin research in general and is referred to as equal environment assumption. This argument claims that many of the conclusions drawn by Boucard and Lycan in their study about genetic influence assume that monozygotic and dizygotic twins who were raised together develop in identical environments. However, critics argue that this assumption is not valid for fraternal twins and treated very differently from identical twins.
Okay, so our second study was called The Nature and Nurture of High IQ, an Extended Sensitive Period for Intellectual Development. Okay, so the aim or why they did the study, the researchers wanted to know if high IQ scores meant an individual would have a longer sensitivity period to the environment, and vice versa. If a lower IQ score meant they had a shorter period of environmental sensitivity and their genetic makeup played a role sooner in their development. The researchers gathered, so like how they did the method is the researchers gathered data from twin studies throughout the world and took the data a step further. They used a regression, which is a measure of the strength of relationship between a dependent variable and independent variable, on the data to see if the characteristics among twins or siblings are more due to heritability, abbreviated as H squared, or the environment, which is abbreviated in C squared. So they wanted to find out if the magnitudes of these scores, H squared or C squared, were controlled by the IQ scores. Going further, they looked at if the IQ score effects were restricted to a certain age range, specifically childhood, 4 to 12 years old, or adolescents, 13 to 18 years.
So here are the results for this study. Here's kind of a summary. So ones with higher IQ, they were found to be more sensitive to the environment during adolescence, and also their genetic influence was decreased or perhaps delayed during adolescence if they have a high IQ. As for a lower IQ, the individuals were less sensitive to the environment and the genetic influence on their characteristics appeared sooner. The researchers found that their prediction to be correct. The researchers discovered a trend that when IQ score was higher, the influence of the environment on the individual was higher as well. So C squared, we said, was the environment, and H squared is the genetics. And so when there was a higher IQ, which is the one of these two, so this is all IQ, these are both the environment on the bottom. And so when there's a higher IQ, so the green line, there's a higher influence on environment, and when there's a lower IQ, there's a lower influence of environment. Versus with this part has to do with the genetics, the H squared, and so when they have a high IQ, the genetic influence is lower, versus if they have a low IQ, the genetic influence is higher. So that kind of summarizes what I said previously. So, in relation to the nature versus nurture discussion, these results show that what a person is more influenced by is not as clear-cut as you may think. If a kid is born with a higher IQ, possibly a result of genetics, this study's results show that later in life they are more susceptible to environmental influence as well, and vice versa. So with a low IQ, they may be less susceptible to environmental influences. So the 40 study chapter says that genetics are 70% responsible for one's IQ. An individual can be predisposed to having a higher IQ because of their genetic makeup. Certain environments and more resources may also increase a child's IQ. After all, individuals with an eventual high IQ score tend to score high from early in development. With a higher IQ, the individual might then place themselves in more stimulating IQ-promoting environments, engage in more experiences, and have heightened levels of attention and arousal. This could allow more sensitivity to their environment to occur later in development. So at the same time, the findings from the 40s chapter are insufficient to fully support this second study. If someone has a low IQ, the 40s study chapter appears correct because genetics have a greater influence on their individual characteristics during adolescence. However, this may also be because the low IQ individual may not have as much of a capacity to respond to these environmental influences. On the other hand, one with a higher IQ, the 40 study chapter seems partially incorrect because although the genetics may cause their high IQ in the beginning, a high IQ could mean more capacity to respond to the environment later on.
So perhaps the timing of brain development could be the influence of IQ. Additionally, this article provides insight on genetic variation and developmental processes that may cause individual differences in cognitive ability. Perhaps exposing children to stimulating environments at a young age when they are most sensitive to the environment will increase their IQ scores. These higher IQs could result in longer sensitivity period for intellectual development and therefore increase their cognitive abilities. At the same time, the heritability of high Q in adolescence would be less and perhaps not play as large a role in IQ until after the adolescent period.
Okay, so moving forward, someday if you have kids, this shows that exposing them to stimulating environments and new experiences can help play a role in their levels of cognitive ability. With higher IQs in the future, they might then be sensitive to the environment for a longer period of time, and their genetic makeup won't take over as soon. But as for now, since most of you or all of you probably don't have kids, this study shows that while your genetics could be playing a large role in your personality and IQ, there's still some wiggle room for you to enhance your cognitive ability or even change some of your personal characteristics. Overall, this information shows that the environment still plays a role in your characteristics, so it may be in your best interest to expose yourself to many different experiences and opportunities. Such opportunities may help you grow and develop in all aspects. Perhaps practicing and studying can improve skills that you're not genetically gifted with. Now we're going to do our quizzes. That one. That one. And the third one. Woohoo! Hey, we get Nick.